Or this dangerous intersection gets a set of lights.
There you go. Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, certainly the safety of pedestrians and the safety of motorists is the #1 priority of the department, and we will do our very best in every case to keep those numbers at 0.
Member Cape Breton-Nova, and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I tabled a petition today with over 200 signatures of residents who are afraid every time they have to use this intersection. I asked the Minister, will you commit to having your staff review this decision in the light of the danger this intersection poses to residents? Thank you.
Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, there is still a review underway, and the department, and I believe it's in cooperation with the municipality of Cape Breton, to determine whether or not there is other electric-type signals that would alleviate the problem.
The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. In 1999, your government promised they would implement a province-wide self-managed care program. My question is, when will the province see a self-managed care program implemented in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we are working on a continuous basis with all elements within the healthcare delivery program toward these objectives, and we're making progress.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This program was a pilot program, and I'm pleased to say was started by the previous Liberal government. This program is not only effective in meeting the needs of the consumer, it has also been shown through a pilot project to be efficient. Mr. Speaker, it saves money. My question is to the Minister, when will they begin the process to implement this province-wide self-managed care program?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
What's that? Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we're moving in that direction now, and it's under review, and I can say to the honourable member that indeed there have been some programs implemented by the previous government that we deem to be worthwhile, and that's one of them.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this program will receive hundreds of millions. This government will receive hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government over the next 5 years. This program enables people with disabilities to stay in their own homes and not be institutionalized. When can individuals wishing to access this program be able to do so on a province-wide basis?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated previously, we're moving in that direction, and we will, as the federal money becomes more available, it will allow us to move that much quicker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of the Environment and Labour. Based on media coverage, it was clear that some people living on the waterfront were unprepared for the seriousness of the situation they were in when Hurricane Juan struck. Now they are faced with the prospect of cleaning up some very unpleasant materials thrown up out of the harbour. Will the Minister tell the House today what warnings were issued to people living on the waterfront before the storm hit, and what information is being issued about cleanup precautions now that the storm is over?
Good question. Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Certainly, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. There certainly were a lot of warnings that went out with regards to the paper and radio, as the Minister responsible for EMO has mentioned here earlier, to let people know what they could expect. And with regards to cleanup, I would suggest that everybody should contact the Department of Environment and Labour if they have a specific concern, and I'm sure they'll get specific information so that they can take care of the particular problem.
The honourable member for Dartmouth, Portland Valley, in her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there are serious potential health hazards involved with some of the materials these residents are finding in their backyards. Mr. Speaker, materials like human waste. What physical and financial assistance is being offered to homeowners to assist with this cleanup so that it's done thoroughly and safely?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. Mr. Speaker, it would be most helpful if specifics of the cases that are being discussed here could be brought to me and we could look at them individually to make sure that they are being addressed as they should be.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we all know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. What plans does this government have to ensure that there is broad public education that will prevent unnecessary illnesses and infections?
The honourable minister of Environment and Labour.
Certainly, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of work that's been done and a lot of educational information that's been available. There's also educational information that's being distributed as we speak and has been distributed over the past few days, and we'll continue on forward to make sure that we have adequate information and educational information out there to protect the public. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Time allotted for questions period has expired. I understand there's an introduction. Order, please. Honourable Premier on the introduction before we go to opposition members' business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would draw to your attention and to the attention of members of the House a special guest in the Speaker's Gallery today. We have with us, enjoying the proceedings, Mr. Rob Anders, who's a Canadian Alliance Member of Parliament for Calgary West. He's in the Speaker's Gallery, and we welcome him to Nova Scotia.
Certainly welcome our guest to the gallery today and hope he enjoys the proceedings. The honourable member for Cole-Harbison Passage on the opposition member's business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll start with resolution number 17, which is on DevCo pensions. And can I call resolution number 17?
Resolution number 17, the honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a resolution that I had brought forward last Friday and would have hoped at the time that would get the approval of the whole House. But due to, for reasons unforeseen to me, it was named. So I think it's appropriate that we bring it back to this House at its earliest possible time, which is today, which is our opposition day. And the reason that I brought this forward, Mr. Speaker, was very clear, that we have something going on here with a federal agency that I had thought that our provincial government would support the pensioners of my community, indeed of all the former pensioners that worked for the Cape Breton Development Corporation and their widows. And it's a very simple task, Mr. Speaker. What we asked was that the Cape Breton Development Corporation stop forthwith the fight it has with the widows and the pensioners and take the excess fund that's in those pension funds and return it to the rightful owners, which are the pensioners and the surviving widows of those employees. But no, Mr. Speaker, during which I thought would have been a fairly straightforward resolution, it was named, and so here we are today dealing with this issue. Now, when speaking with the government, the federal government on this, it's a very interesting thing. The two local members of parliament, who are both Liberals, say, "Oh no, we have no jurisdiction over that. We have nothing to do with that. The Cape Breton Development Corporation is an arm's length corporation, Crown be it, but it's still an arm's length from us." That's their position on these pension funds. Now, same group of people had ran for office and told all of us how they were going to protect the Cape Breton Development Corporation, but when it comes to the rubber hitting the road, so to speak, Mr. Speaker, they move off that issue. They say, there's a duly appointed board of directors, and we have nothing to do with that, and so therefore we wash our hands off it, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's see what they're saying about those funds. Is it funds that are going to help the people in the affected communities due to the closure of the Cape Breton Development Corporation? No, Mr. Speaker, quite opposite. What the government is going to do is they're going to use this as part of their closed down costs of the Cape Breton Development Corporation. They're taking the hard-earned money of the coal miners from the Cape Breton Development Corporation taking their hard-earned money and helping to pay down the closure costs which they began, which the federal government began. So we're not only going to kick you out of work, we're going to take your excess pension funds also. And they believe this is all right. The local MPs stand by and say, yeah, that's it. It's an arm's length Crown Corporation. We have no problem with that. But let's look at some of the complexities or perceived complexities around those pension plans, Mr. Speaker. Now, there is two types of pensions, by and large, with the Cape Breton Development Corporation. One was what's commonly referred to as the non-contributory pension, and the other pension is which is commonly referred to as the contributory pension, which was brought in later in the mandate of the Cape Breton Development Corporation. Now let me talk about the latter first, because it mirrors more accurately what we see in businesses in many workplaces today is a 5% contribution by the worker and 5% contribution by the employer, and these funds go into one pot and are to be meted out upon pension as a defined benefit package. So that's probably the easiest one to explain. It's your basic, very fundamental defined benefit package pension. It's not a money purchase pension, it's a defined benefit package pension, Mr. Speaker. So which allows, by that fact, it's allowed to accrue, and therefore from time to time you will see excesses in that fund. So what's next is what's commonly referred to, which every employee of the Cape Breton Development Corporation had access to, was the non-contributory. Now, the non-contributory was basically a pension plan set up with contractual obligations with various unions, and the employer, if you will, paid the full costs. But as my learned friend over there says, right, but the infamous but here is, how did they arrive at the non-contributory pension? Was it out of the goodness of the employer who said, look, we're going to put in for you a full, unfettered, defined pension plan for you? No, that's not it. What had happened is, actually, we have to go back quite a few years, almost 90 years, for the essence of how the non-contributory started. And I don't want to belabor it that far, but by and large, what happened was, in the struggles in the coal fields back in the early 1920s, there was problems, obviously, not just with pensions, but overall wages and overall working conditions. One of the aspects that was arrived at for a pension plan through many very arduous contractual obligations type of contractual negotiations was, they arrived at a pension fund predicated on this method of the long ton versus the short ton. I forget the exact number, but I think the visualness of those words describe it. One, you would mine a long ton, but it would be sold. It would be theoretically bought at you as a short ton. So what you're doing is that excess capital will be going into the business. So if you mined a long ton, and say at that time was being bought for $5 a ton, your endeavors would show it as $3 perhaps. But part of that saw-off was that the extra capital that the employer was allowed to gain would there go into setting up what's referred to as a non-contributory pension plan. So basis in fact, it was a contributory plan, only that it was administered solely by the employer, and was not taking off as a seeable or visual deduction every week or every 2 weeks, however you would be paid. So that's how that arrived. So we kind of fast forward again to the late 60s when the federal government sets up a crown corporation, and it took them about 30 years to do it. They set up a crown corporation to close the Cape Breton coal fields, but indeed what they did is in the time frame when they were in the midst of setting up the Cape Breton Development Corporation, there was as many of us in this House remember, a problem with OPEC. We had oil shortages and an energy crisis, and again, coal became much more fashionable, and then we saw the construction of such thing as Lingan Generating Power Station, which is on my back door, and which has just lately been called the heaviest polluter in this province. But that's a whole other issue rather than today's debate. But so we're there, and so at this point we have real negotiations going on between the leadership of the Cape Breton Development Corporation and the leadership of the various unions that represented employees, with the acknowledgement that the idea of long ton, short ton was still an aspect, it was still on the table, and therefore that's how, and that was, by the way, that the non-contributory pension fund would be paid for. So it brings us here today. Why is the government taking those funds? As I said earlier, the reason that they're telling the public is they're taking those funds to help pay down the closure costs of the Cape Breton Development Corporation, which, is evil enough if they had held back, say, on the overall compensation package that they had been paying the miners, which by industry standards was extremely frugal. They did not give them anyways adequate pension packages going out the door, and there was I appreciate the fact that anytime you do negotiations and there's a line drawn, there's going to be people one day on one side of it, one day on the other side of it. So this was a real problem that the federal government had incurred. So they really nickeled and dimed the employees, as they were going out the door. So they're going out the door, and they've really given them inadequate pensions. Now, we've had these other people out here who, through the auspices of the Cape Breton the Devco Pensioners Association, who have been fighting this long before even the outright kind of ownership of Devco's closure was taken over by the federal government, that these folks were saying, look, there's excess funds in there, and we believe that we should have access to them. So did the federal government help them? No, it fought them every step of the way, even to the point that there is an arbitration system within their pension system to fight this very problem, to talk about what you do with these excess funds. Now, was the federal government upfront and honest with these folks and said, okay, okay, we all agree, bang, we're going to hit in, and we're going to allow the arbitration process that's set down on paper for us to go forward? No, the federal government took these people right to the Supreme Court. Now, kind of on the 11th hour, for reasons unknown to me, some of the unions got involved and are, to the best of my knowledge, allowing and helping these proceedings with some legal advice. Whether they're paying the lawyers directly or not, I'm not sure. But previous to this, there was huge meetings held in and around the coal fields of Cape Breton where you would actually see lineups of 300 and 400 pensioners and their widows willing to put their $5 down to be able to take part in a class action suit against the federal government to redeem this money. Now, what's interesting about this fight is there's nobody in this area going to get wildly rich in this, Mr. Speaker. The estimates run from anywhere from about $2,200 to maybe a max of $4,000 in what revenues could be gained by these people. We're not talking about, any kind of great change in their lifestyle. It would be a little bit of comfort money for them, maybe to help them to this, this winter coming up and all these other things. That's all we're talking about in average here. But the federal government, and I can only categorize it as an extremely mean-spirited act, has put just another piece of shame on the hard-working coal miners of Cape Breton Island. They weren't satisfied in degrading them by closing the industry. They weren't satisfied with degrading them by giving people that gave years of their lives to that industry with inadequate pensions. Now, they want to push them down even a bit further. They're saying to the very people that built these towns of New Waterford, Glace Bay, Dominion, North Sydney, Sydney Mines, Reserve, these areas, we're saying to them, no. Your government would rather take that money and use it where it wants to use it rather than put it in your hands. We don't respect the hard work that you have done in supplying this province, this country, through times of war, through times of energy crisis. That's all out the window now. It's all our money. And we don't care what we put you through. We believe we own it. We're taking you to court, and we're going to take it from you. And that's shameful, Mr. Speaker. I believe that governments work because, A, obviously they're elected, but when in power, have to use a line of compassionability towards its people. Now, Mr. Speaker, $2,000 to $4,000 in the pockets of pensioners in and around the coal fields of Cape Breton, I believe, will be much more wisely spent in their hands than in the hands of a federal government that has shown how well it can manage money around its gun registry. So, Mr. Speaker, that's what we have to look at. That's what we have to look at when we look at. That's why I bring this motion forward, this resolution forward. It's not a matter of saying, give us something because we want it. I believe there are cases, now, and I think if they go to court, they'll prevail. They will prevail, but it's the indignation of it all. It's the fact that they just can't see what's right. And we also know very well that through the court process, it's going to be an expensive process. And so when they do win, when these pensioners finally come to collect what money is owed to them, it'll probably be halved by the time they get all this together, Mr. Speaker. So this was the reason I brought this forward last Friday. It was the reason it was my first resolution before this House, before this session, was to show that there has to be a line of compassion, that this money, no matter who's right or who's wrong, is best put in the hands of the people that toiled in the coal mines of Cape Breton for this money. That is the widows and the pensioners. And Mr. Speaker, to give it anywhere else, whether it's to the judicial system or to government agency, is simply wrong. That it's the people in the coal fields of Cape Breton that own and deserve that money, and that's where it should go. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and indeed it's a pleasure to welcome you to the chair. As the first opportunity I've had to speak with you in the chair, and I certainly look forward to it. I would like to make a few comments and a few interventions on the motion put forward by the member from Cape Breton Centre. And, Mr. Speaker, I think the thing we should make clear here at the very first, as the honourable member from Cape Breton Centre referred to the government, I know he was referring to the federal government, but I just want to clarify that for all the people might be watching, or the people indeed in the chamber here, that I made the assumption he was referring to the federal government, because I think we all agree and understand that it's a federal government responsibility. But I think, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member from Cape Breton Centre gave us a fairly good lesson in terms of how this is developed. But as he mentioned, in the 90s, when the federal minister cut the funding to DevCo, this process was put in place. And as the honourable member knows, there is a process, there is a superintendent, and it's very clearly spelled out in the Pension Act how the process is to go. But Mr. Speaker, I think before I start and make some comments on that, I do want to recognize and say to the honourable member that I am not from the area of Cape Breton, and my riding is not in the area of Cape Breton, but we do recognize the severe impact that the DevCo closure caused in that area. We do recognize the tradition of coal mining in that area and how the impact of this change involved a lot of people. And indeed, a lot of people, that was their livelihood, and they had worked at it for a long time, and the family tradition went on in that area. And Mr. Speaker, there is no question that that was a dangerous occupation, and we all understand that, and that was well known to everybody. And I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that if those mines were open today, there would still be people working there, because there is people that would take on that challenge. They saw that as a way of life, and they would continue to take on that challenge. But Mr. Speaker, before I go too much further, I would like to say at this point that that is one of the things why this government has worked hard to negotiate the relinquishment of the mine leases from DevCo, so that Nova Scotians could have control over these resources. Mr. Speaker, it's been a long time in working on that. With the Cape Breton Development Corporation has finally relinquished these leases, and it's been a long time to get to there. As part of that, we all understood that DevCo had to act responsibly. Now, I think it was interesting to note that the member from Cape Breton Centre talked about the contributory, non-contributory plan, and indeed the member knows quite well that as we got into the late 50s and the 60s, those non-contributory plans were becoming quite prevalent across this province. And if you look at our major utilities across this province, you will recognize that they had moved to a non-contributory pension in that base. And I think the honourable member would also recognize that they were based on incentive plans. There wasn't some incentive to build it, because if the corporation made money, the corporation could put money into the pension plans, and indeed they could have the money to invest in those, and that would provide the pensions. Now, the honourable member talked about the pension non-contributory and the contributory plan. I know the honourable member knows the numbers that I have seen is that there's about 5,800 people in the non-contributory and only 9,900, I believe, in the contributory plan. So as he said, the weight factor was clearly the population people, the greater number were in the non-contributory plan. Mr. Speaker, I did, as I recognized earlier, and we talked about who owns this problem, if you will, or who's involved with this file. I do notice, as looking at the Cape Breton Post this year, I noticed the federal member for Brador, Cape Breton, the MP from there, indicated, my reading was the same as the honourable members, that he indicated that DevCo was an arm's length, therefore the federal government weren't involved. I did also note in the newspaper articles from July that the honourable member's federal leader was in Cape Breton on one occasion, and his indication was that he was going to go back and fight, I believe the words were, with the federal government to try to resolve this problem. So indeed, he recognized where this debate had to be. I also noted in some newspaper articles that the leader of the NDP was in Sydney, and he indicated they were going to become an intervener in this. And an intervener, indeed, and they were going to be an intervener in the Supreme Court case. Well, that's where I'm going with this. Is that when the NDP leader said he was going to be an intervener, I presumed he was talking on behalf of himself. I don't know if he was talking on behalf of the Premier, but I noticed he indicated he was going to become an intervener, and so. Oh, he's going to be Premier.
Oh,
okay.
he's going to be Premier?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this issue is going to take about 4 to 6 months, so the NDP leader is going to have to hurry along if he's going to be a premier to be an intervener here. But I presumed when I saw that as he said he was going to be an intervener, that he was going to coach the government. And that's why when I looked at this resolution, the resolution said that you condemn people who are not going to give the pension. The resolution didn't take the next step, which said there was going to be intervener status or who was going to do it, and I was surprised to see that. But I think let's go back to DevCo, Mr. Speaker, and let's look at the issues that they have and what they've been doing. One, we know, and as we've been working with the DevCo in terms of the coal leases, we know that DevCo has to be responsible for the subsidence. The reclamation and environmental issues and remediation is part of that reclamation, and they have to be involved in that. And also, as we look at the transfer of leases, we have to look at what these opportunities could do. These opportunities, Mr. Speaker, need to set up legislation to provide an equitable distribution between the employers and the employees. And indeed, there is examples, Mr. Speaker, of areas where people in cooperatives have gone into the leases. And I know the honourable member is well aware that the Cape Breton Miners Co-op, the 30 miners that formed the co-op, and with their severance packages to look at acquiring some of these resources. And indeed, as these resources become more available, there will be opportunities to acquire these. But I think if we just kind of put this in context, I think we are looking at somewhere in the vicinity of $26 million in terms of the non-contributory plan in the surplus and 9.1 in the contributory surplus. And indeed, the first review of this indicated that there was 3 areas and 3 people who had to be involved and had to look at these. And as I said before, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has to approve the termination of this. And indeed, that is what the challenge is now in the Supreme Court, is to direct those. I was, Mr. Speaker, interested in the review of the past few years that the honourable member brought to us as to how the pension plans had developed and how they had formulated. And indeed, going back as he did into the 1900s, early 1900s, how those pension plans had developed. But that brings the issue, the question that the issue that's raised here is what is going to happen to surplus. Now, we all recognize there is formulas. We all recognize there is legislation which governs this. What this resolution is trying to do is moving outside the regulations and going to the political will. And indeed, it's the political will that the honourable member is speaking to, and indeed, he's talking about whether the federal government has the political will to forget all what's written in the books and all of the regulations and everything and move to go do that. Now, Mr. Speaker, so the lawyers only can go so far, and people then have to enter into this. But I think, Mr. Speaker, I do want to state the government's position here. What this government has said on more than one occasion is that we know it's a federal matter, and as I've indicated before, we know that it's a federal matter, but we hope that the federal minister and those other peoples that are involved will do the right thing for the former employees. Now, the right thing is the question is they have to evaluate how much, and the honourable member said if you take the number of people and divide by the surplus, you come up with $4,000. However, it's up to the Supreme Court to decide if there is real costs that have to be associated with it, and obviously the costs that have to be netted out for that. So I think what I'm saying from our government's position is that we hope that the federal government tackles this and does the right thing for those people. I am not in the position to stand here and say that I know that there is this cost that has to go to the fund, or I know that the fund is up or down now because of the marketplace. I'm not in a position to say that. The real question here is what is going to happen to those surplus, whatever they might be at the end of the day in the determination. And the motion is suggesting that we condemn people. We condemn the people who have taken the pensions away from people. But I think the more important issue is that we send a message from here that we think that DevCo and the federal government should do the right thing. And that's, in essence, that's what I heard the honourable member saying. I heard him saying that he believes they are rightfully should rest rightfully with the pensioners and the widows. And I think from our position, we're saying the right thing would be to return that money to those people, calculating whatever costs and whatever details that you have to calculate, but at the end of the day, you'll return them to those people. But I think also, Mr. Speaker, that we need to send a message that there is other areas of hope, and that's why I raised the DevCo leases and the leases that there are other areas that people can get involved in. There's areas that we're not just talking about perhaps here's your pension money and that's it, everything is quiet now and everything is going away, that there is hope, there is things that are happening for those people so that they will understand that some of these things are going on. One of the things that did concern me, and I did, as I mentioned, I had an opportunity to look at some of the Cape Breton Post articles surrounding this, is that, and the members obviously from Cape Breton would be well aware of that, is that there seemed to be, when this discussion of the surplus came up, the populace and the people that were on pension seemed to be concerned that perhaps something was going to happen to those pensions that already had been fully vested. And I think people have to be fully aware that we're not, and there's no discussion here about any change in the pensions that are fully vested. It's only, and as the honourable member raised, only the additional money and when there would be additional on top of those. So I know the honourable member has had an opportunity to assure people down in his area that the pensions that they're currently getting are not affected. It would be in addition to. So, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to have that opportunity to enter the debate. The honourable member from Cape Breton has brought a good point to the House, and I think it's certainly worthy of discussion. And as I say, from our perspective, we believe that the federal government, where the problem lies, should be challenged to do the right thing, and hopefully they will. So, Mr. Speaker, I guess as we talk about this and we communicate with the federal government, and we all, the honourable member mentioned he had spoken to his MP. As we look at the other MPs from our areas here, we need to communicate that to them. So as they meet and discuss this, they can look at how they're going to challenge it. But I guess, Mr. Speaker, I did hear the honourable member say that he believes that the court case is already lost. Now, maybe that's right, and as I heard him say, I think what I heard him say is that the case, okay, that the case, okay, that the case is I think what I heard him say is the case is stacked against the pensioners and the widows, and that it was going to that court case was going to go on and perhaps not. I don't know if I take that pessimistic a view of it. I think that as the court looks at it, as the court looks at the superintendent's reports, and the court looks at all of the different issues in here, that perhaps they will draw the same conclusion, that the people who worked on the production side of things, the people who worked on that to put the money in there, will have a substantive portion of that to come back to them. So I do think, Mr. Speaker, that this issue is something that the court will have to will grapple over. But I think that indeed, as the federal government looks at it, they will probably start to view it in a little different light. That after they've got the actuarial reports in, after they've looked at the costs and everything, they will see that this is probably an issue that arose while people were working in Cape Breton and while they were mining the coal, and that it will stay with those people. So as I say, I don't take such a pessimistic view. I think perhaps there's some opportunities here. But I do, in closing, Mr. Speaker, I do want to say that we, as the government, think we will encourage the federal government to try to do the right thing through our members, and indeed encourage other parties to encourage the federal government to meet the challenges there through talking with their MPs. But I do want to leave the message that with the coal leases and developing that, there will be opportunities down in that area for people to continue doing that, and that although we can take some negative views on these things, I think if you open it up and look at both sides of the issue, this one is a challenge, but there will be opportunities down there. There will be issues that can be met. This happens to be one of the issues that has to be dealt with, and Mr. Speaker, I think this will probably be dealt with. And then I'm encouraged to hear this coming before the House, and I think as we all speak to our federal MPs, that perhaps we can encourage them to try to do the right thing. So, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to pleased to have an opportunity to make an intervention on this resolution today, and I look forward to hearing other members on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I first of all want to thank the member for Cape Breton Centre for putting forward this resolution and giving me the opportunity to talk about this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I wasn't sent to the Legislative Assembly in Nova Scotia to apologize for the actions of DevCo's Board of Directors. I wasn't sent to the Legislative Assembly of Nova Scotia to apologize for the actions or words of federal MPs from my area. And I wasn't sent to the Legislative Assembly of the province of Nova Scotia to apologize for anything in terms of what I believe personally to be what is rightfully and morally belongs to Cape Breton coal miners. Mr. Speaker, I do have some exceptions to the way the resolution has been worded. And I take some exception because I can't stand here and condemn someone. I think condemning someone is a fairly strong statement. To condemn someone for what they may have thought they were doing was the right thing to do. How am I to stand here and say that perhaps members of DevCo's Board of Directors, who some are provincially appointed, some are federally appointed, some are former coal miners, how can I say that those people didn't actually think they were doing the right thing? And how can I condemn them for perhaps at least thinking that they're doing the right thing? Now, having said that, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member for Cape Breton Centre who gave us a quick rundown on non-contributory and contributory pensions for Cape Breton coal miners, and certainly I know the member for Cape Breton Centre has the background, and I appreciate that, and he did a fairly good job of explaining exactly what happened. But when you're explaining it, and when you start using words such as evil, or nickeled and dimed, or mean-spirited, or degrading, then I have to wonder, what's the purpose? Is it the purpose because you're really strong and forcefully believed in the resolution you're putting forward, or are you putting forward a resolution just to try and grab a few headlines and make political hay out of a situation which we should not be making political hay out of right now? This is too serious to be even doing that. What we have here is a group of employees, a group of men who put forward their blood, sweat, and tears on behalf of not just their families or Cape Breton, but on behalf of the province of Nova Scotia, by the way. At one time, Cape Breton Coal powered this province and made it exactly what it is, Mr. Speaker. At one time, there were 14,000 people that were employed in the coal mining industry in Cape Breton. At one time, there were 11 coal mines alone that operated in Glace Bay, just Glace Bay. This was an industry, Mr. Speaker, that meant everything to this province. And granted, Mr. Speaker, this is an industry that is now gone. No one could be any less happy about that than myself, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the member for Cape Breton Centre and many other members in this House would agree with that as well, and they do not want to see what has happened. The fact of the matter is, DevCo has closed, for whatever reason. We've moved on to a certain extent, but there has been some things left behind, Mr. Speaker, that perhaps could be cleared up. The DevCo pension issue is one of those things that has been left behind, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, and again, I'm not here to defend anybody with the Board of Directors. I personally, and I've made these statements in the press, disagree with the decision they made. I think this probably at best should have been sent to arbitration. There are many cases of things that have happened at DevCo that have been settled by third parties in the past. In recent memory, both decisions regarding closures, arbitrators were involved. Outhouse decision was one of them. And this has been done over the past for many, many times at DevCo, that a third party would become involved to decide finally what was going to happen in regards to whether it be pensions or wages or whatever the case may be. Mr. Speaker, if you're dealing with what perhaps would be a very stringent set of rules, which I'm to understand are set out by the Financial Institutions Administrations Act, which is what governs these pensions, and which governs, in particular, DevCo as a Crown corporation, then perhaps, just perhaps, I wasn't at the board meetings, I didn't attend, I'm not a member of DevCo's Board of Directors, but perhaps because of those stringent regulations, they had no other choice. They had no other choice. Now, I don't think anybody can say that's not a possibility. Surely if we're all thinking people in this chamber, then at least we can think to that extent that perhaps this was a possibility. They had no other choice but to do this. And the directors, perhaps working in the best interests of what they thought were the best interests of the corporation, decided the only path to follow was to send this to a court of law and finally deal with it once and for all. Now, Mr. Speaker, on that note, before I continue, and as the minister stated, perhaps somewhat in error, I think the member for Cape Breton Centre made it perfectly clear that he hopes that the court decision will come out, and he believes the court decision will come out in favor of DevCo's miners. And that is my hope and my wish as well. And also, it's my way of thinking, Mr. Speaker, that will happen. But I wanted to make that clarify that, because I think the minister perhaps didn't hear it exactly the way it was said. Now, getting back to the pension itself, Mr. Speaker, arbitration, as I said, probably was, in my personal opinion, the best option that could have been followed. And it certainly was allowed for under the Financial Institutions Administrations Act as well. And I understand that miners are upset during the election campaign, Mr. Speaker. Heard about it all the time. Heard about it from miners themselves who said, look, we deserve this money. We own this money is ours. It's not a great deal of money when you put it in perspective. No, it's not a great deal of money. And I agree with them. I have no problem whatsoever taking that stand, Mr. Speaker, and saying that I agree with them. I agree that this money should have been dealt with. But there are times when we have to take things to stages that we don't want to. This is an example. This is now before the courts. In November, as I understand it, there are groups that will be given standing to appear before the courts and argue on behalf of their organizations. The DevCo Pensioners Organization, the United Mine Workers Union of America are a couple of groups that will be arguing. And as I understand it, I even think that the two MPs in the area are considering applying for standing before the court to argue their case on behalf of DevCo miners. Now, I don't know whether or not they've received permission or standing before the court. I'm not sure. And I'm not sure what other groups there are. I'm sure there would be many other interested groups. And I'm not sure if the minister, again, is right in suggesting that the NDP was one of those groups that perhaps would consider applying for standing before the court. I don't know, because, again, I don't attend NDP caucus meetings either, Mr. Speaker, any more than I attend DevCo Board of Directors meetings. And I'm not looking for an invitation either, Mr. Speaker, by the way. But what we have to do here is just for a minute not let this be turned into anything more than what it should be, Mr. Speaker. And this has been used as a political football, not only by the NDP, but by other people as well. Many, many times, Mr. Speaker, this has been used by them to try and get miners and their families, up in arms and outraged over the fact that this is their money. It's being taken away from them. That DevCo has been closed. Industries have been destroyed. We know that, Mr. Speaker. We know that it's not what it used to be, that things aren't the way they used to be, and probably never will be again, Mr. Speaker. But at some time, you turn the corner, and you hope that things will be better. You know they will be better. You deal with what's before you. I am one of the few people that still happens to believe that there is a place in Cape Breton for a coal mining industry. There are 3 billion tons of coal out underneath the ocean, and there's all sorts of people waiting to buy that coal. Now that, Mr. Speaker, I'll put directly in the laps of the provincial government, because they eventually will own the leases, the coal leases. And it's up to this provincial government to finally turn things around, in this instance, in the coal industry, and promote private industry, help them as much as possible, and get a private industry coal operation and putting people to work in Cape Breton once again. Provincial government knows that can be done, Mr. Speaker, and they know it's a great possibility that it actually will happen. Mr. Speaker, I again have I congratulated the member for Cape Breton Centre for bringing forward the resolution. And when I first heard him read the resolution, and this happens in this chamber quite often, a resolution can be read, and all of a sudden when it comes time and a request for a waiver of notice is given, and the speaker will say, is this agreed? And occasionally the speaker will hear a no, and the speaker will say, the notice is tabled. Well, Mr. Speaker, in this case, there was a no that was heard, but let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, unequivocally, that no did not come from any member of the Liberal caucus of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, and I'm not saying anyone suggested that it did. I just want to make that perfectly clear. Although there were some mutterings, perhaps. There were some mutterings from some members that it did come from here. Well, Mr. Speaker, it did not. Obviously, it didn't come from the NDP caucus. That probably leaves only one other place for it to come from, Mr. Speaker. But I want you to know that it did not come from this side of the House. It did not come from anybody who sits as a member of the Liberal caucus in this province. Because, Mr. Speaker, we have shown over the years, previous leaders of this Liberal caucus, previous premiers, Liberal premiers in this province, have shown, and when they were members of Parliament at the time, have shown that they cared as much as anybody could possibly care about the employees of the Cape Breton Development Corporation and their families. And in particular, I'm talking about former Premier Russell McClellan, who was an MP who represented the area for many, many years. DevCo was one of his top priorities while he was an MP. And Mr. Speaker, there is a fact, we forget sometimes that we talk about all of the bad things that happened not only at DevCo, happened over the years, but in Cape Breton, but we talk about some of the great things that happened there as well. This was an industry that thrived. This was an industry that had tremendous workers. This was an industry that had people who were proud to go to work on a daily basis and showed up in one of the most dangerous industries you could ever be employed in. Mr. Speaker, my relatives worked in the coal mines. My relatives worked on the railway. My friends worked in the coal mines. There were people that I went to school with who perhaps sometimes back in the heydays when they were hiring, they left school to get a job because DevCo was the only thing around that was employing people. But it also gave you a good, secure job at that time, Mr. Speaker, which would carry you through to a retirement and hopefully a proper pension. Now, Mr. Speaker, as my colleague from the NDP from Cape Breton Centre has said, there are many people who rightfully deserve this pension. There are a lot of people now who unfortunately are not with us who would have deserved this pension, and I would have been glad to see a lot of my friends and family, relatives, and neighbors who I wish they were here now, Mr. Speaker, to listen to people talking about can we get an excess in funds from the DevCo pension fund, because if they were, it would mean that they were collecting a DevCo pension themselves and that they were still on this earth to be doing exactly that. But that's not the case. Some of them passed on because of the fact that they had spent many years of their lives employed in the coal mines, Mr. Speaker. So it's a matter, Mr. Speaker, that at home has, one could say, I guess, touched a nerve in a lot of people. It's one that is it's personal because of the fact that the people involved believe that the money is certainly theirs, that it belongs to them. It's taken its ups and downs because it's been tossed around, as I said, by a political football by some people. But it's also been used and abused in some cases by some members and by some parties to try and make some hay because of the fact that this is an issue that upsets a lot of people. And Mr. Speaker, whether or not some members of this chamber think it's appropriate or not, again, it is a point to be considered, and one that should be considered very carefully before we vote, before we get to approving these resolutions, and actually when we consider them. As I said, we have to, well, the language in it itself, when you condemn a board of directors, Mr. Speaker, that has some committed people on that board of directors. If not, I'm sure they're all committed to what they're doing. But the fact of the matter is that they work. Does it matter if they're Liberals on the board of directors, or if they're New Democrats, or if they're Progressive Conservatives? Can you not be committed if you're from any political stripe? Is that not possible? Or are we too narrow in our thinking to think that perhaps that can even happen? Well, I believe, Mr. Speaker, and I think, again, most free-thinking people would realize that if you're committed to a job, regardless of what political stripe, you can still be committed. You can still make decisions, the right decisions, perhaps. Does making the right decision, does being right or being morally responsible and exclusive ownership of the New Democratic Party of Nova Scotia? I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. I don't think so. You know, there are other members in this chamber who belong to two other political parties in this province who certainly believe that you can make the right decision regardless of your political stripe, Mr. Speaker. So I find, Mr. Speaker, that, again, I did thank, and I meant it, that I thank the member from Cape Breton Centre for bringing forward this resolution. And I agree with it to a certain extent because I agree personally, myself, that this money, that these pensions belong with the people who own them, Mr. Speaker, and that would be DevCo's miners and widows who put them there and certainly deserve them. They should be back in their hands. And I also think, as the member from Cape Breton Centre does, we don't agree on a lot of things, but these are two things we've agreed on. I think that the current court case will end up with that decision, Mr. Speaker, because I don't think there's any other decision that could be the right decision to make. Of course, that's up to a judge now, and the judge will decide whether or not what happens in this case. Again, Mr. Speaker, to make it perfectly clear, did I hope or did I think or did I wish that it would end up at this stage before a court? No. I would have hoped that the decision would have been made by whomever, Mr. Speaker, that they rightfully belong back where they should have been with DevCo's pensioners and widows, and I still, to this very day, believe that that is going to happen, and Mr. Speaker, I have spoken out on it many, many times that that is my wish. So again, I want to congratulate the member for bringing it forward. It's been a pleasure to stand here and always talk about the great respect that I have for coal miners, that I have for the miners and their families over the years, for my friends and my neighbors and my family, Mr. Speaker, that as I said many, many times, that the blood, sweat, and tears of those people has certainly made it possible for me to be here today and to talk about exactly what I'm talking about. And I want to thank you for your time, Mr. Speaker. And with that last message, I will again take my chair. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll continue debate with the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With great pleasure, I join the debate on this resolution. I think it's an important one, one that underlines the unfairness of the situation with respect to the DevCo pensions. I couldn't help but observe the attitude and the demeanor of the previous speaker, and I must say, Mr. Speaker, it's the member for Glace Bay is often entertaining. He has a kind of bombastic manner that he portrays in almost everything he does, and he argues, though, almost always that black is white, that you shouldn't have to take any responsibility for those decisions that are made by those in your party at other levels. I mean, he's quick to heap, of course, scorn on the government federal colleague or those in our party, but of course, that's part of the rhythm that the member has. He can argue in almost a perfect circle. You know, he begins at the point where he's taking absolutely no responsibility, and he ends at the point where he takes absolutely no responsibility. And that's not a surprise, but it is sometimes a wondrous thing to watch unfold. That's for sure. But I do agree with him on this point, Mr. Speaker, and that's this: that the miners who worked in the mines of Cape Breton didn't do it just for their family, for their own benefit, didn't do it just for the right to work, to put money into the economy in Cape Breton. They worked in order to be able to supply energy to all of the people in this province and further afield, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell you something else I know about the miners in those communities, whether it's in New Waterford or in Glace Bay. when they walk down to the pits with their pit helmets and with their lunch kettles, and when they walk down to take their shift in the mines, they weren't just men going to work. Mr. Speaker, they were symbols. They were symbols of the strength of a community. They were symbols of the stability that was brought by coal and by their hard work to those communities. So they were much larger than life in many regards, Mr. Speaker, the contribution made by the miners in Cape Breton. And that is why it is with such great disdain I hold the decision that has been made by the Board of Directors of DevCo, and complicit in that decision, of course, is the federal Liberal government. I mean, the reality is that it's simply outrageous that the federal Liberal government is not happy enough with wiping out good-paying jobs on the island of Cape Breton. They have to come in afterwards and take the pension funds that belong to the miners, that belong to the widows, that belong to the families of those people who poured their blood, sweat, and tears into the work in those mines. So that's what makes it such a difficult thing to have to deal with. And I listened to the entreaties of the Minister of Finance, who did a fairly good review of the press clippings from the Cape Breton Post and the Chronicle Herald, but other than that said, not much of anything. And he wanted to continue to say that, well, this is a federal government responsibility, and that's true. We all acknowledge that this is the responsibility of the federal Liberal government. But that doesn't get you off the hook. That doesn't get you off the hook in this matter. You have a responsibility to the people of this province, to the people of Cape Breton Island. Has the Premier of this province so much as lifted a finger to write a letter to the Premier to object on this matter? Not to our knowledge. Have they taken any steps to try and support the Pensioners Association? Not so far as I'm concerned. During the last election, Mr. Speaker, I made it clear that an NDP government would use the resources of the province to support the pensioners, to support the miners and the widows of those who worked in the mines, that we would seek intervener status. We didn't do that because we thought it was a good political statement to make. We did it because we said it because it was the right thing to do. We said what we meant, and we meant what we said, Mr. Speaker, and that's what's disturbing about this. And yes, much has been made about the fact that this was a non-contributory pension, but the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that pensions are simply the wages of miners that have been bargained for and that have been delayed in order to make sure that they have a decent standard of living once they retire. That's what pensions are. They're wages by another name. Why is it that the federal government should feel free to come in at a time when the economic base of those families has been taken away and decide to further impoverish them by taking their pension benefits? This is not fair, as far as I'm concerned, by any stretch of the imagination, because in those negotiations, when the non-contributory pensions were set up, the employees of DevCo gave up other benefits. They made wage concessions. The reality is that those funds in those pensions belong to the miners. They belong to the pensioners. They belong to the widows of those miners who died. And that's where they ought to belong. They belong in the hands of those people, and they belong in the economy of Cape Breton. And it's a responsibility of the provincial government to stand up and say so. It's not a surprise that the federal Liberal government would do this. I mean, they're all about finding ways to wring money out of people who need it the most. I mean, just look at the federal government's attitude toward the EI fund. How much money has the federal government taken from the contribution of working people? Billions of dollars, Mr. Speaker. Billions of dollars robbed out of the EI fund. And this province is suffering because of it. That is money that would have went into the economy of Nova Scotia, but doesn't because the federal Liberal government has appropriated. They did the same thing. They did the same thing with the CHST, which was nothing but a way for the federal government to reduce the transfers to Nova Scotia and to other provinces, frankly, so that it could underfund health care and other important social safety nets in this province. They did that to the tune of billions of dollars. And what do they do with it? I mean, I don't know what they did with the money. I mean, I suppose it went toward, fattening their bottom line. Maybe they used it in Mr. Radwanski's office. I don't know. Maybe they used it in the billion-dollar HRDC bungle. All I do know is that it's not going back into the pockets of the people of Nova Scotia, into the pockets of the people of Cape Breton Island. When I was in Cape Breton, talking with the miners, talking with the Pensioners Association, and we met with them on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, they said to me, well, this shouldn't be a surprise coming out of the federal Liberal government. I mean, this is the same kind of thing that Paul Martin did with the employees of Canadian steamship lines. Same kind of thing. Now, I don't know that that's the case, Mr. Speaker, but that is belies the attitude that people have taken with respect to the way that the federal Liberal government treats people who should be who they should consider to be in a fiduciary relationship with them. That is, Mr. Speaker, that they should be charged with the responsibility for looking after pensioners and widows and their families. So it begs the question, and the member for Glace Bay said he's not here to apologize on behalf of MPs from his area. Well, no wonder. I mean, where has Mr. Eiking and Mr. Kuzner been in this? Barely a sound. In fact, if it weren't for Alexa McDonough and Wendy Lill and Peter Stauffer, the name Nova Scotia would almost never be heard in Ottawa. If it weren't for those MPs standing up. Well, something, Mr. Speaker, the minister says, what about Peter MacKay? And it is true, we hear about Peter. Whenever he's made another deal, we hear about it. There's no question about that, Mr. Speaker. Whenever another deal has fallen down or another backroom deal is going down, Peter MacKay is at the root of it somewhere. But that, Mr. Speaker, is a debate for another day. That's a debate for another day. So, Mr. Speaker, that's the problem, and they recognize it only too well, Mr. Speaker, is that there are not enough champions for Nova Scotia in Ottawa. If there were more champions of Nova Scotia, like Alexa McDonough, like Wendy Lill, like Peter Stauffer in Ottawa, we'd be a heck of a lot better off than we are today, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality. It is completely unbelievable, Mr. Speaker, that, well, Mr. Speaker, they laugh, but who was the only MP to ask questions about the hurricane damage in the House of Commons? That was Alexa McDonough. Who are the people who consistently raise issues of importance to Nova Scotia? That's the NDP caucus. That's who raises them, Mr. Speaker. That's who raises them. So, Mr. Speaker, and when it comes to this, the Minister of Finance is quite correct. The federal leader of the New Democratic Party, Jack Layton, felt it was an important enough issue, whether or not the miners, the pensioners, and their widows have the right to get what they're entitled to. He thought that was an important enough issue to travel to Sydney to meet and to talk with those concerned and to pledge the support of the federal Democratic Party caucus in that endeavor, Mr. Speaker. And that's because he recognized the injustice that was being done by the federal Liberal government and vowed to help set it straight. And that was the right thing for him to do, and it would have been the right thing for the Prime Minister to do, to come and the only time that the Prime Minister came to Cape Breton was just before the federal election, in a rather crude attempt to influence the vote there, which apparently he did, because he got two MPs, and I got to tell you, I don't know if you've been to Ottawa and saw the setup there, Mr. Speaker, but the MPs there have a really good view of the Prime Minister, because they sat on the other side so they can get a good look at him. They may never get a chance to talk to him, but they got a good view of him, that's for sure. So, Mr. Speaker, so what are the details of this? We got a $26 million pension fund, money that could be going into the Cape Breton economy, that could be going into communities in Cape Breton North, in Cape Breton Centre, in Glace Bay, but instead, Mr. Speaker, is going to be appropriated by the federal government for their own purposes. And we say that's wrong, and I think that the Devco Pensioners Association, certainly President Sam Boutlier, along with Leo Evans, Pat Burton, and Omar McPherson, who we met with, myself and the member from Cape Breton Centre, certainly understand, certainly, and the member from Cape Breton Nova, that's right, certainly know that what is happening to them under the federal Liberal government is wrong. And we're not the only ones who think that, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that the mayor of Sydney has said on occasion, and vociferously, I might add, that this is wrong. And I know that they have taken steps to try and impress that point of view on Ottawa as we have. And our point in bringing forward this resolution today is to say, well, you know, there are other avenues other than just an election campaign when this can be pursued. And the House of Assembly is one of them. And, Mr. Speaker, our entreaty to the government is to don't sit around. This is like, you know, I'll draw an analogy to the Maritime Life decision. You know, surely they're not going to sit around and simply let those jobs leave the province. They're not going to sit around and simply allow that engine of the economy to go down. Well, you shouldn't be doing that with respect to the pensions either, Mr. Speaker. That's pension money that could be going into the economy. And the government, through the appropriate offices, through the Premier, or through the appropriate minister, should be on the telephone, should be writing the Prime Minister and expressing the extreme dismay of the province of Nova Scotia in this decision. You know, I don't think that's a long stretch, Mr. Speaker. I think this is only a reasonable request. It's one that's been put forward time and time again. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have said that were we the government of Nova Scotia, we would seek intervenor status in the court challenge. And part of the problem is that of course the province of Nova Scotia has the resources to be able to put forward that case in a forthright manner. The problem, of course, for the pensioners and for the those involved in this court case is that it puts a very onerous burden on them to come up with the resources to be able to support litigation. And the province knows this. I mean, they know what it costs. I mean, they look at, for example, in the Laurentian sub-basin fight, the amount of money that was spent by the province in order to advance its case during those hearings was, as I understand it, a very large bill to the province. This one is going to be substantially less, but no less important to the people who are affected, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we have said right from the very beginning that the moral thing to do, the appropriate thing to do, is to join the pensioners and the widows and their families in saying very clearly that we're not going to stand by and allow the federal government to take what rightfully belongs and what was rightfully paid for in the mines of Cape Breton by the miners and their families. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's pretty clear what the government ought to do. It certainly would be a good thing for the Liberal caucus in this House to support us in this regard. I understand, Mr. Speaker, that you're signaling that I only have a minute left, and before I do wind up, I wanted to say this, which is that I think the Minister of Finance, in talking about the federal government taking responsibility for subsidence and those issues associated with DevCo, that he's not correct in that. They have never admitted, so far as I know, to taking responsibility for issues related to subsidence. If that was the case, then perhaps the school issue in Dominion would have been resolved more quickly and more favorably than it otherwise has been. So DevCo has, in fact, proved to be a very, very difficult negotiator when it comes to issues between the province. I think, if anything, taking the stand with respect to the DevCo pension monies would be another lever for negotiation by the provincial government. But right now, Mr. Speaker, what I would like to see happen in support of this resolution is I'd like to see the provincial government take a strong stand, and I'd like to see the Liberal caucus take a strong stand in support of the miners, the pensioners, and their families. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Continue debate with the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'm pleased to speak on this motion having to do with the closing of the Cape Breton coal mines and also the disposition of the assets or the surplus in the pension funds. Mr. Speaker, just to set the record straight, one may say, why am I particularly interested in this? First of all, I do, in a former life, I had done a bit of mining. Never in the coal mines, but I did do hard rock mining for a couple of years. And I do understand back when I did it. That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I did that. The conditions were not quite as what they are today in working in mines, I might say, in terms of this. But the thing that puzzles me, Mr. Speaker, is rather than this particular resolution calling for some literally resolution to this issue, and which, by the way, I support, is what the resolution talks about is condemning the DevCo Board of Directors. And I don't know why they want to condemn the DevCo Board of Directors rather than wanting to do something about the problem. I mean, that would seem to me to be a more productive and proactive thing to do. Well, I don't know, but it would seem to me that if there is a problem, the best thing to try and do is solve it. And why would you put a resolution out there condemning the Board of Directors rather than saying, let's change the decision and get on and work with the federal government, put pressure on the federal government, and try to, I mean, there's no question that this is something that was created by the Liberal government, by the Liberal government with probably support of the NDP members up there. Where were the NDP? I mean, I haven't heard Alexa McDonough stand up and say anything about the pension surplus in DevCo. I haven't heard Mr. Layton stand up and say anything about it. I haven't heard Peter Stauffer stand up and say anything about it. All they want to do, the issue is if you got enough to complain about, Mr. Speaker, then you get your name in the paper.
Order. Recognize Honourable Member from Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you? No, it's not a point of order. On the next matter? Yes. Can we call resolution number 51?
I'll recognize the Speaker for resolution 51. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Very much, Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in my place to speak on a resolution I brought to the House on Friday with respect to the first strike in the history of this province in a transition house in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And it's unfortunate that we have to have this debate, frankly. However, as most members in this House will know, transition houses are emergency shelters where women and children in abusive situations, in intimate relations, sometimes have to go to get away from the crisis that they experience. And in the small community of Amherst, the transition house there, Amherst House, or Autumn House, the workers have been on strike since the 11th of August. Mr. Speaker, this is a small transition house. It has 6 beds, 10 workers, and sadly, the Minister of Community Services and this government have turned their backs on this situation, and we're hoping to draw some public attention to the situation and encourage the minister to take responsibility for what is happening there. Now, Mr. Speaker, the workers who work in this shelter are women whose work is to prevent violence. They do a lot of outreach in the community and education. They work with women and children who come into the shelter when they require safety. They deal with the crisis that's happening, the physical, the emotional crisis. They assist them in getting legal services, medical services. And the women who do this work are well-trained. Many of them have degrees in the social services. And for this, Mr. Speaker, they earn what could be considered quite modest wages, salaries, annual salaries in the high $20,000 to low and mid $30,000 range, Mr. Speaker. Not high wage by any stretch of the imagination. They receive no paid overtime. They have no pension plans. And the benefits that they have, Mr. Speaker, apparently are few and are of little importance to this government and this minister. Mr. Speaker, the issues in this labor dispute are around things like job security, the board of directors who are their employer, a volunteer board, as is in the case of most of these, all of these shelters. A volunteer board has put forward ideas like being able to use volunteers in certain aspects of the work, a reduction in benefits that are currently enjoyed in the shelter by the workers, a reluctance to pass on the wage increase, the modest wage increase that this government provided for in its funding, and a changing in the scheduling, the shift scheduling. Now, many of these issues are at the bargaining table, and there has been some give and take, but yet the situation has not been resolved. And frankly, it hasn't been resolved, and it won't be resolved because behind this dispute is an inadequacy of funding. The shelter, like all shelters in Nova Scotia, is funded by the Department of Community Services. And as we saw with the RRSS strike, the minister has attempted to hide behind the structural legal framework where there is a volunteer board of directors who in fact are legally constituted as the employer but don't have the financial independence or ability to provide the kind of support that is required to adequately compensate the workers for the job that they do. Mr. Speaker, all transition houses in Nova Scotia run deficits, and because government funding is inadequate and they have to fundraise or find grants from other levels of government to meet their program and staffing commitments. And Autumn House is no different. It's been running a deficit, and this has placed an extraordinary amount of financial pressure on that board to find ways to deal with their financial crisis. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Community Services knows full well that these houses are underfunded. He has in front of him a report from the women's centers, the transition houses, and the men's programs back in the summer months that indicate what is required to adequately fund these organizations. He has been silent on responding to that report. He has the power to assist in the settling of this strike in Cumberland County. I want to point out to the minister, and he can go back to his department officials and check, that many other of the shelters in this province, Bryony House, Chrysalis House, Harbour House, the Transition House in Yarmouth, they have all run deficits in the past. They have experienced crises, and governments have come to the aid of those organizations to keep them from shutting down their services and closing their doors. And yet we see foot dragging in this situation. And I would like the minister to tell the workers, the board members, and the people of the Cumberland County area that is served by that shelter what is different about the Amherst area that your government isn't prepared to intervene to assist in a crisis when previous governments have intervened in Halifax, in Yarmouth, in Kentville, and in Bridgewater. I would like that question answered for the people in Cumberland County who are served by that transition house. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I've been on both sides of this issue personally. I've been a member of a volunteer board of directors of a transition house. I know how difficult it is to find money. I've also negotiated on behalf of workers who work in these shelters, and I know how much these workers are prepared to work with inadequate compensation. But I want the minister to tell us here today why his department and his government is unprepared to fund these services like other services in this province that deal with protection and security. We do not ask the police departments, the fire departments, the child protection agencies, the adult protection services to raise 5, 10, 15, 25% of their operating budgets for core services by holding bake sales and benefit suppers and dances and bingos. So why are we asking women's services that deal with the safety of women and children to provide that, to deal with those kinds of activities to get adequate funding? So these are questions that the minister needs to stand in his place and answer, because the people in Cumberland County now have been for quite a significant period of time without a service that they have dedicated themselves to over a good many years. The final point, Mr. Speaker, is that Autumn House has a unique model of operating that provide outreach services that has been recognized right across this country as a valid and important model for providing services in rural communities. And this will be lost if this organization is forced to cut in the way that it is being made to do so by the Minister of Community Services. So these are questions we would like answered today in this debate, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
For the NDP, I'll now recognize the honourable member, Minister of Community Services.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for bringing the resolution forward. The operation of not only Autumn House, a transition house in Cumberland County for the victims of domestic violence, but all 9 across the province are of great concern to this government, this department, and this minister. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to start by saying that as such, the member opposite has referred to an equitable way of trying to treat all the transition houses in the province, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, that is exactly what we strive to do. There is a funding formula in place, and I'm sure the member opposite would recognize that. I'm sure that she would also recognize that it is not 6 beds, but it's 9 beds that are funded by that formula, by that funding formula that provides for 8 full-time equivalent employees. They're paid for entirely by the Department of Community Services. If any transition host wishes to be creative and augment their services, we certainly encourage them to do so, and they have done so. But if they go outside the funding formula, Mr. Speaker, one would expect that they would make provision to fund those additional services that they want to add to the provincial model. To the member opposite, I want to tell her that in times past, I've enjoyed her exuberance in the House, and sometimes when those of my gender have gotten a little over exuberant, she has pointed out to us that there's a lot of testosterone floating around in this room. I do want to just gently chide her for the therefore be it resolved that the Minister of Community Services stop hiding behind the skirts of the Autumn House Board. I liked that the term that she used here, hide behind the structural legal framework, was perhaps a more dignified way of making her point, but my point is that touche with regards to the levels of testosterone. So, but, honourable member, if you're wondering whether I was paying attention to some of your past dissertations, please take note. I think, Mr. Speaker, ultimately we should never forget the reason why we have transition houses. And it is a sad reflection that we need them. It's a very positive reflection on this government, or this during our last mandate, that we made changes to the family violence legislation, and that we put in place provision so through justices of the peace that the abused members of the family, the battered wife, the children, can have immediate possession of the matrimonial home, and also protection for the matrimonial assets. That goes to the root of the problem. The transition houses provide an interim solution to give those members of our society the protections that they need, that are necessary because of the unfortunate relationship that is developing in that home, the abuser. It's very important that we have these services. And Mr. Speaker, when the department saw that there was the possibility of an interruption of service, we asked the board to put together a contingency plan to ensure that the women and children in Cumberland County would always have access to those services. They did bring forward a contingency plan, Mr. Speaker. That is paramount. We should never lose sight of the reason why these transition houses are there. It is to serve the battered spouses, the battered women and their children, and that is in place. It's working. Support has been arranged with other transition houses and the local police services. The crisis phone line is still in operation, and department staff are in regular contact with the executive director to ensure the contingency plan is in place and people are getting the help that they need. And that is the case, Mr. Speaker. So let us not forget that the primary purpose for this is to care for those battered women and their children in time of need. Mr. Speaker, that said, it's important to point out that these negotiations are not between the government and the union. The government is not the employer. The employer is a dedicated board of directors, and as the member opposite offered up to the House, she in fact held one of those positions in a past career, past life, and it is an honorable thing to do, to offer in that capacity. And we must respect their role in this. It is Autumn House and their board of directors that is the employer, not the Department of Community Services, not the government in Nova Scotia. And we will respect the collective bargaining process. Clearly, we are disappointed disappointed that an agreement could not be reached to this point in time between the employer and the union. But again, it is not our role to interfere in the collective bargaining process directly as a third party. We respect the employees' right to exercise their rights under the Act. Mr. Speaker, the conciliator has been in place and remains in place. And then the parties are able to go back any time and draw on the conciliator's expertise to bring forward a negotiated settlement. And it is the position of the government, it's the position of the department, and it's certainly the position of me as minister to urge the parties to work hard at the negotiating table to get an agreement. That is the only place where real progress can be made to bring an end to this dispute. Mr. Speaker, we are very proud of our work to support victims and to address the issue of family violence in Nova Scotia. The province funds 9 transition houses in communities across the province. Transition houses receive funding to hire staff and cover operational costs to serve the number of beds in their house. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to emphasize again that the funding is for 100% funding for those 8 full-time equivalent employees that covered 9 beds for the women and children in need in Cumberland County. If the board chooses to provide additional services or hire additional staff, that is certainly their right to do so, and that is one of the advantages of having a local service delivery model, such as provided by this wonderful board of directors and their wonderful staff. But if they do so, clearly they're responsible for covering the costs of those services. The honourable member talked about volunteers and bake sales. I would point out to the honourable member that in rural Nova Scotia, there are a lot of organizations that do this. The one that comes to mind, volunteer fire departments. Wonderful, wonderful group of people, not unlike the people that are involved in the Autumn House situation. Mr. Speaker, each year taxpayers provide more than $4 million to support transition houses in Nova Scotia. But Mr. Speaker, that's not the end of it. They recently received additional funding to provide a 9.3% wage increase to staff, adding approximately $300,000 to transition house annual budgets. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the province funds 6 men's treatments programs in Nova Scotia and 7 women's centres across the province. Autumn House in particular receives approximately $360,000 for transition house services and $83,000 for their men's treatment program. We've also provided the services of a professional negotiator to move along the negotiations to hopefully bring about a negotiated settlement. Mr. Speaker, it's clear these are important services. It's clear that the Autumn House staff are dedicated to the people they serve, and the volunteer board cares very much about these services. We are doing all we can, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate a successful end to this labor dispute. Thank you.
Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in support of this particular resolution, albeit for slightly different reasons, but the general principle in support is one and the same. Mr. Speaker, in Cumberland County at Autumn House, last year alone, there have been more than 5,000 counseling sessions that have taken place. 5,000 in Cumberland County alone. Mr. Speaker, I heard the minister indicate that it was not the minister's and the department's responsibility to become directly involved in the collective negotiating process. I will present evidence to the contrary. Mr. Speaker, the minister has suggested that abused women and children should go to the nearest crisis center. Okay? Where is it? Tyrman Place in Glasgow. That's the nearest one. Is this minister for real? That an abused woman or child or family has to travel 135 kilometers to get any help? Is that the type of support that's coming from this government and this minister? I hope not. Now he's downloading the responsibility for transition houses on volunteer fire departments. Can you believe it? This morning, they were downloading the responsibilities for EMO on volunteer fire departments. What is it going to be tomorrow? They already have the responsibility as first responders. How much can volunteers do? Mr. Speaker, in July 17th of this year, the minister's own department issued a communique to the executive director of Autumn House indicating quite clearly that the reason for providing additional funding was to deal with the salary increases, retroactive back to April of 2001. So, Mr. Speaker, clearly the minister is involved. In the year 2000-2001, a 2% increase. 2001-2002, a 2% increase. 2002-2003, a 2% increase. And then for the next fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, a 3% increase. I will table that, Mr. Speaker, when I'm finished. So clearly, the minister behind the scenes is directly involved with these negotiations. I spoke with the union representative, Mr. Speaker, as late as this morning, and he's agreed that they would accept that. But this Autumn House was only prepared to offer retroactive till April 1st, 2003, period. So where is the money going? That's the question. And where does the minister and his department play a role in this, Mr. Speaker? I would suggest that they play a very active role behind the scenes, particularly since the executive director has that. It's ironic, Mr. Speaker, the very day that the contract expired and strike notice was issued, back on August 11th, the administration from Autumn House went in and said, effective immediately, every employee in this facility is now going to be paid minimum wage. Minimum wage, Mr. Speaker. How in the name of heavens can 4 employees that are essentially the main breadwinners in a family, women supporting their children, are going to survive on minimum wage? And the minister knew this. The minister knew exactly what was going on. And what did he do? He did nothing. He did nothing, Mr. Speaker. What about this solicitor for the board, Mr. Dave Mimmercook? Who is providing the extra funding for this particular solicitor for the board? If it isn't the Department of Community Services, behind the scenes is providing the extra funding. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, all the issues, as I understand, have been resolved. And there's a mindset within Autumn House to deliberately and methodically not solve this strike matter, to keep these people out on the street. Why? It's for no other reason than to save money to meet the bottom line. That is callous, that is cold-hearted, that you couldn't get more stone-hearted than that, Mr. Speaker. And this minister knows that. And to stand up and expect an abused woman or family or child to travel 135 kilometers to seek help in the middle of the night, hoping that some volunteer fire person will take them there? What kind of leadership do we have in that department? Mr. Speaker, it is absolutely shameful. You know, Mr. Speaker, Statistics Canada on the violence against women clearly indicate that in Cumberland County, if you want to take income levels, Cumberland County, they are 3 times more likely to be abused than at the national level. And you know, Mr. Speaker, they are twice as likely to be abused in Cumberland County than they are here in Metro. And it is a factor of income. The minister knows that, and if he doesn't know that, then he's not doing his job. But that doesn't surprise us. He's probably going to ask the volunteer firemen to do that work for him. Mr. Speaker, how much more can the people of Cumberland County take? Mr. Speaker, there was a national program called Mr. Speaker, it was a national program that was set up by the federal government in concert with the provincial government called Nova Scotia Crime Prevention Initiatives. Now, Mr. Speaker, there was over $777,000 allotted to Nova Scotia, a little more than a year ago, to deal with these issues, to get to the core source of all the problems on violence against women and children in this province. And you know, Mr. Speaker, what's so sad about this? Not the fact that they've been so successful in 38 initiatives, but not one from that department was allotted to Cumberland County. And Mr. Speaker, I will table that as well. And I'm sure you, Mr. Speaker, as a member for Cumberland County, would be quite concerned that Cumberland County was the only municipality in the province of Nova Scotia that got $0 to deal with violence against women. Why? Why isn't this minister doing something to help the women and children in this province? Mr. Speaker, I say shame on that minister. Mr. Speaker, any household, according to the national statistics, show that the lower your level of income, the more apt you are to be in a violent environment as a mother with children, or as a spouse most subjected to violence. Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on, Mr. Speaker. I'll just highlight. For example, in Cumberland County, the average wage level, average income there is about $22,000. Well, the threshold on the national level is $30,000. Okay? That would show that if you're making $30,000 or less, that means you're more apt, 3 times more likely to be abused. Well, Mr. Speaker, clearly that income level is well below that. Why is there such an indifference to women and children in Cumberland County by this minister and this government? Why? I mean, 5,000 in such a small populated area of the province. It begs to wonder what's going on up there, Mr. Speaker. And the minister will stand up and say, well, we can't get involved because that's not their responsibility. And maybe some community-spirited organization could go out and do some fundraising. Bake some cakes or cookies or a fudge sale. Oh, by golly, Mr. Speaker, this is not how you deal with some of the core problems in society. Mr. Speaker, this minister can kind of make some I don't know, offhanded remarks about the resolution, but this resolution speaks to a very, very core problem in our province, and that is, Mr. Speaker, that we are not dealing with some major, major issues. Mr. Speaker, do you know that battered women are 3 times more likely to be injured during pregnancy, and they are more likely to have an abortion or miscarriage than those who aren't? I would ask the minister to examine those statistics. Never mind passing it off to volunteer organizations. Step in. All the issues are there, Mr. Speaker. There is absolutely no reason for this strike not to be settled. There is no reason for these employees not to be on the job helping people that need help, and that minister should get off his butt and do something about it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Order, please. Order, please. The all member for Cape Breton West would know that was unparliamentary, and I ask him to stand and retract that statement, please. Mr. Speaker, he should get off his chair and do something. That'll work. Thank you. The all member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to close the debate by focusing on the impact of this ongoing strike on 3 groups of people. First of all, the clients of Autumn House. Secondly, the workers. And also bring in a new factor, what message this is sending from the government to the voluntary sector of Nova Scotia. The clients in Cumberland County are not getting their full service. They've been 7 weeks without it. I'm still not clear on how much of the service they're getting from the comments of the Minister of Community Services, and I will be checking into that. But these are women and children who are either suffering from family violence or potential family violence, and who have taken the courageous step of trying to turn their lives around by seeking service. And I'm sure all of you recognize that this is a tremendous feat of courage for people to admit to someone else outside the family that they are suffering under these conditions. And when those services are not available in their community, that might be the time that they're ready for them. They may not seek them in the future. I also want to mention the men's abuse treatment program that's been cut or stopped in Autumn House because it's an in-house program. And if some of the other outreach programs are continuing, that one certainly is not. And in this program, men are shown that it is very inappropriate to deal with their anger, their frustration, their stress levels by taking it out on their loved ones. And so they learn improved ways of communication, and they also learn better coping skills so they can deal with the stresses and strains of their lives without taking it out on their wives and their children. So these women, these men, these children are in crisis now, and they need a full range of programming in their community at the moment. I also want to talk a little bit about the workers in this situation. As you all know, the provincial government cut out $897,000 from transition houses, women's shelters, and men abuse treatment programs last year. And so it's as a direct result of this underfunding that this strike has happened. It's put a volunteer board in a difficult situation where, because they've taken a very innovative approach, a made in Cumberland County approach to this.
Community Services. On point of order.
Mr. Speaker, a very significant statement made by the member opposite about the funding for transition houses. I was wondering if she could perhaps bring evidence forward that shows that anything to the contrary about supporting the funding for the existing funding for transition houses was in place in the last budget. What I'm trying to say, Mr. Speaker, is that she's made the statement that we cut funding to transition houses, and I would suggest that is not so.
Obviously,
and I would ask her to bring forward evidence supporting her allegation.
Obviously, it's not a point of order, but it's a disagreement of the facts between the two members, the minister and the member. But the honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley has the floor.
Thank you. I will check into that, but I do know that the funding for transition houses is now on a temporary quarter-by-quarter basis, and that lack of security, I may have misled people by the amount, and I will check into that. But the lack of secure funding for these boards and these transition houses is the genuine, true cause of this strike. And I just want to remind the members of the House that this strike is not over wages. The 10 individuals, the workers, the councillors from Autumn House are actually, the core problem here is their concern about losing benefits that they have long fought for. They are very close together on the matter of wages. They expect and they deserve fair wages, fair benefits, and fair working conditions. And unfortunately, in the voluntary sector, the workers are continually undervalued and underpaid. I personally come from the volunteer sector. I worked there for 15 years, and I certainly know of what I speak. Many of these 10 individuals are primary wage earners, and the matters of long-term disability, whether they get long-term disability premiums paid or co-paid while they're on maternity leave, the number of hours they work under what conditions, these are very, very important issues to these individuals and their families. Also, I just want to pick up on the fact that it's a very innovative service. And the minister did mention the fact that, well, if they abided by the regular funding formula, they wouldn't have a problem. So here we are punishing a group of individuals, the board and the workers, for finding a solution that works well in a rural area of Nova Scotia. And I think, Mr. Speaker, you certainly would sympathize with that. Transportation is a big problem in rural Nova Scotia. And by providing in-community services, it allows more and more people to take part in these programs, and it also provides some prevention services within the community that people might not otherwise go and seek. I just want to finish up by talking a bit about the voluntary sector. We have seen time and time again community organizations, community boards suffering because they have been underfunded. They're providing crucial services that in many provinces of Canada, the provincial government are providing. But in our case, those responsibilities have been downloaded to many of these community organizations. And the message they're getting is, do it our way or you won't get the funding, which is not something I think most people would see as a benefit. We're also seeing the message going out to people, if you get on a board of directors for one of these voluntary organizations, then the government's going to download the responsibility to you to make the tough decisions caused by the lack of government funding or adequate government funding. And as I mentioned earlier, this sector is providing crucial, very crucial programs and services that otherwise the government would have to provide. So it's in all our best interests to invest the proper amount of money, the adequate amount of money in these organizations that are providing these programs. We saw earlier this year the strike because of at the Regional Residential Services Society. Again, a board of an organization was not given enough funding to be able to adequately compensate their workers or do the work that they're expected to do. So I just want to say that time and time again, rural Nova Scotia is told to use a community development approach where they can find solutions to their problems in ways that best suit the needs of their people. And you can't turn around and then talk about a provincial funding formula that only recognizes one model of working in a community. Because I think we've all found there's no one right answer to any of these programs and services. You've got to have the flexibility and the credibility to be able to adapt them to the needs of individual counties and areas. So I just want to finish by saying that it's a lack of consistent, secure, adequate funding from the Department of Community Services that is the background for this whole issue, and that it's been suggested that we are certainly going to be judged, I think, both as political leaders and others, that how we treat the most vulnerable in our province, in our communities, is how we will be judged. And I just want to suggest that this is a crucial matter not only to the clients who are not being served adequately, not only to the workers who are out on strike over benefits that they need to support them and their families in rural Nova Scotia, but also, excuse me, and to the board members, who are concerned about, is this too much responsibility for me to serve my community in this way? These are really serious issues, and the message to the broader voluntary sector is very ominous, and I think the minister and the department really need to look at this closely. We're probably only talking a matter of $20,000 difference to settle this strike. And the impact is huge. And I really think as responsible decision makers, it's up to us, all of us, most especially the government, to make sure this strike is settled as soon as possible.
Thank you. Time allotted for opposition members' business has expired. We reached the moment of interruption, but before we do, I'll call upon the Honourable Government House Leader for tomorrow's hours and business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House will meet tomorrow at 12 noon and sit until 6 p.m. The order of business following the daily routine will be public bills for second reading, and we'll continue with the debate on Bill number 1, the Insurance Act. And Mr. Speaker, on Friday, as I said yesterday, we will sit from 9 until 3, or until we complete whatever business we have before the House on Friday morning. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is the House adjourned until 12 noon tomorrow. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Reached the moment of interruption. The subject of this evening's late debate was submitted by the honourable member for Waverley Fall River Beaver Bank. Now recognize the honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to rise in my place tonight to speak about the efforts of all of Halifax Regional Municipality's employees, the business community and the residents of the municipality, both federal and provincial agencies, the media, and the many volunteers who are devoting their time and efforts to make emergency relief operations possible over the past several days. It is through the hard work of public servants such as Barry Manuel of the Emergency Measures Organization, the coordinator for the Halifax Regional Municipality, that we are patiently able to restore the electricity and the services to our city and to our province. Damage to our coastal regions, wharves, and the selective deforestation of landmarks such as Point Pleasant Park and the Halifax Public Gardens are shocking reminders of the fierce weather brought upon the province by Hurricane Juan. Given the darkened state of the city, police have been busier than normal. HRM RCMP experienced double the regular number of calls in a 24-hour period, and Halifax Regional Police had 3 times their normal total as they each dealt with reports of looting, vandalism, and an occasional mischief call. The activity of the Halifax firefighters is almost 10 times its regular level, with most calls due to small fires and alarm malfunctions. Fire stations throughout the HRM are also producing and providing drinking water to residents in need from many fire stations in each fire service area. When Hurricane Juan left the province in the early hours of Monday morning, it left behind a province with almost a third of its residents without power. Through long hours and unflagging efforts, Nova Scotia Power Incorporated has been able to reduce the number of